on the windswept Texas Panhandle in 1893. Some encounters change everything. Trace Morgan was just another drifting cowhand, riding the mesa at dusk with nothing but his horse and the weight of old sorrows. He'd sworn off settling down after losing the only woman he'd ever loved. But when he spotted young Hallie Ray Cooper struggling through the dust, dragging a heavy sack of firewood while tears carved tracks down her weathered cheeks, something stirred in his chest he thought had died years ago. Her father, once a respected trail boss, now lay broken by whiskey and shame in their crumbling homestead. The winter was coming hard, and they had nothing left but each other and a dying hope. What Trace did next would test everything he believed about second chances and the courage it takes to love again. But would his decision to help this struggling family lead to redemption, or would it awaken the ghosts that had been chasing him across the frontier? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver compass in Trace Morgan's vest pocket had belonged to his father, a man who'd never lost his way until the day he died. Now, as Trace guided his sorrel gelding down the rocky slope toward the struggling figure below, he wondered if the compass had finally found its true north after all these wandering years. The girl, for she couldn't be more than 22 or 23, had stopped dragging the burlap sack and was wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. Even from a distance, Trace could see the proud set of her shoulders, fighting against the weight of whatever burden had brought her to tears. Her auburn hair had escaped its braid and caught the dying light like spun copper, and her worn leather chaps spoke of someone who knew honest work. "Easy, Buck," Trace murmured to his horse, though the animal had already sensed his rider's intention to stop. Buck had been with him for 6 years now, through 3 states and more lonesome nights than either of them cared to count. The horse understood that sometimes a man had to pause his journey, even when every instinct told him to keep riding. Hallie Ray Cooper looked up at the approaching rider with eyes the color of sage after rain-weary, but not afraid. She'd been raised on this harsh land, where strangers could mean trouble or salvation, and she'd learned early to read the signs. This cowboy sat his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle, but there was something in his posture that spoke of gentleness held in reserve. "Evening, miss," Trace said, touching the brim of his hat. "Looks like you could use a hand with that load." She studied his face in the gathering dusk, weathered but kind, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many sunsets. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and his hands, resting easy on the saddle horn, bore the calluses of honest work. Most telling of all, he made no move to dismount without permission, respecting the invisible boundary that surrounded a woman alone on the prairie. "I can manage," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd been crying. "But I thank you for the offer." Trace nodded, understanding pride even when it wore the face of desperation. He'd worn that same expression himself, back when Sarah had been dying, and he'd refused help from neighbors who'd only wanted to ease his burden. "I'm sure you can, but sometimes managing alone and managing well are 2 different things." The words were spoken without judgment, and something in his tone made Hallie's shoulders ease just a fraction. She glanced toward the distant shack, where lamplight flickered weakly in one window, then back at the stranger, who'd appeared like an answer to a prayer she'd been too proud to speak aloud. "My father," she said, and then stopped, as if the words were too heavy to lift. "He's not well." Trace dismounted then, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. He'd learned long ago that trust was something to be earned, not taken. "I'm Trace Morgan, been riding for the Double J outfit, but they're laying off hands for winter." Hallie Ray Cooper, she gestured toward the collection of weathered buildings that had once been a proud homestead. "That's our place. Was my grandfather's before my father took it over." The past tense hung between them, heavy with meaning. The Cooper Ranch spread across a natural valley where a creek had carved green life from the red earth. Even in the fading light, Trace could see it had been built with care and knowledge, the barn positioned to catch the morning sun, the house set back from the creek, but close enough for easy water access. The corrals were solid, built to last, though several rails had broken and hadn't been mended. A windmill stood sentinel over it all, its blades turning lazily in the evening breeze. But it was the small details that told the real story. Shingles missing from the roof, a broken window covered with oiled paper, a gate hanging crooked on its hinges. This was a ranch dying by degrees, and Trace recognized the signs from his own past. "Your father ranched this place long?" he asked, bending to take one end of the sack without waiting for permission. 23 years, Hallie said, accepting his help with a grateful nod. "Since he married my mother. She passed when I was 15. The sack was heavier than it looked, filled with split mesquite that would burn hot and slow. Pa was different then. He was." She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "He was a good man. Still is, I suppose. Just lost his way some." They walked together toward the house, the sack between them, making conversation easier somehow. Trace had learned that people often talked more freely when their hands were busy, as if the work gave their words permission to flow. "He was a trail boss," Hallie continued, her voice growing stronger with each step. "One of the best in Texas, before the railroad came through. Could move 1,000 head of cattle from here to Kansas and not lose a single calf. Cowboys would ride 100 miles just to sign on with Samuel Cooper." Trace heard the pride in her voice, and something else, daughter's desperate love for the man her father used to be. "What happened?" "Winter of '89, she said simply. "Lost a whole herd in a blizzard north of the Red River. 1,200 head and 3 good men besides. Pa never got over it. Started drinking to forget, but all it did was make him remember harder." The story was familiar in its bones, though the details were different. Trace had known other men who'd been broken by the weight of responsibility, who'd tried to drown their failures in whiskey and found only deeper water. His own father had walked a similar path, though it had been a war that had changed him, not a blizzard. The house was smaller than it had looked from a distance, built of good timber but showing the wear of neglect. The porch sagged slightly, and the steps groaned under their weight. Through the window, Trace could see a figure slumped at a rough wooden table, a bottle catching the lamplight beside him. "He's not always like this," Hallie said quickly, following his gaze. "Sometimes he has good days. He'll work on the fence or tend the horses, and for a while it's like having the old pa back. But then something will remind him a storm cloud or the sound of cattle lowing, and he'll disappear into that bottle again." Trace set down his end of the sack and straightened, his back protesting the long day in the saddle. "How long since you've had help around here?" "Near on 2 years now. Had to let the hands go when the money ran out." She looked around the yard, seeing it through his eyes, the accumulation of small failures that added up to a larger defeat. "I do what I can, but it's a big place for one person." "And winter's coming," Trace observed. "Winter's coming," she agreed. "Pa says we should sell, move into town, but this place is all we've got left of what we were. If we lose it—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Trace understood. Some things, once lost, could never be found again. The wind picked up then, carrying the scent of coming snow and the sound of cattle moving restlessly in the distance. Trace looked at the broken fence, the sagging porch, the girl who was trying to hold it all together with nothing but determination and love. He thought of his own wandering, the towns he'd passed through without leaving a trace, the people he'd met and forgotten. For 6 years he'd been running from the memory of Sarah's death, telling himself that attachment only led to pain. But standing here in the gathering darkness, watching Hallie Ray Cooper fight to save something precious, he felt a stirring in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold wind. It was the feeling of being needed, of having a purpose beyond the next town and the next job. It was the compass needle swinging toward something that might be home. "I could stay the night," he said carefully, "help you get that wood split and maybe take a look at your roof. Storm's coming in and you'll want to be ready for it." Hallie looked at him for a long moment, weighing the offer against a lifetime of hard-learned caution. "I don't have money to pay you," she said finally. "Wasn't asking for money," Trace replied. just offering a neighbor's help. The word neighbor hung between them, full of possibility and promise. On the frontier, neighbors were the difference between survival and surrender, between community and isolation. It was a sacred trust, not offered lightly or accepted carelessly. "There's a bed in the barn," Hallie said at last. "It's not much, but it's clean and dry." "That'll do fine," Trace said, though he found himself thinking that anywhere near this brave young woman would feel like luxury after 6 years of hotel rooms and bunkhouses. From inside the house came the sound of glass breaking, followed by a string of curses that would make a mule skinner blush. Hallie's face went pale, and she hurried toward the door. "Pa, you all right in there?" Samuel Cooper's voice came through the thin walls, slurred but recognizable. "Just knocked over the damn bottle. Leave me be, girl." Hallie's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, and Trace saw in that moment how much this cost her: constant worry, the vigilance, the weight of caring for someone who'd given up caring for himself. It was a burden no one should carry alone, especially not someone as young as she was. "Let me help," he said quietly, and something in his voice made her pause. "He's not dangerous," she said quickly, "just sad. So terribly sad." "I know," Trace said, and he did. He'd seen that particular kind of sadness before, in his father's eyes after the war, in his own reflection during the darkest days after Sarah's death. It was the sadness of a man who'd lost more than he could bear and hadn't yet learned how to live with the empty spaces. Together, they opened the door and stepped into the house that had once been a home. The room was clean despite its sparse furnishings, and Trace could see Hallie's hand in the details: wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill, a quilt folded neatly on the worn sofa. The sweet scent of bread baked that morning. She was fighting to keep beauty alive in a place that had forgotten how to hope. Samuel Cooper sat at the table, staring at the broken bottle at his feet. He was a big man, or had been once, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard work and hands that had known how to gentle horses and move cattle. But now he seemed to have folded in on himself, as if the weight of his regrets had compressed him into something smaller and more fragile than he'd ever been. "Pa," Hallie said gently, "we have a visitor. This is Trace Morgan. He's going to help us get ready for the storm." Samuel looked up then, and Trace saw eyes that had once been sharp and commanding, now clouded with alcohol and grief. But there was still intelligence there, and a flicker of something that might have been hope. "Cooper," Samuel said, attempting to rise and then thinking better of it. "Samuel Cooper, this is my daughter, Hallie Ray. He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing all her virtues in a single movement. "She's everything good that's left in this world." "I can see that," Trace said, and meant it. He moved carefully around the broken glass, his presence neither threatening nor judgmental. "Fine place you've got here. Good bones." "Good bones," Samuel repeated, as if testing the phrase. "Had good flesh on those bones, once. Now it's just—" He waved his hand at the room, the broken bottle himself. "Just bones." Hallie knelt beside her father's chair, her hand on his shoulder. "Pa, why don't you go lie down? I'll clean this up and get some supper started." "Can't sleep," Samuel said. "Dreams come when I sleep. Better to stay awake. Stay." He reached for the bottle, then remembered it was broken. Better to stay awake. Trace understood. He'd fought the same battle in the months after Sarah's death, when sleep brought only memories of her voice, her laugh, the way she'd looked at him with such trust and love. Staying awake was easier than facing the dreams that reminded you of everything you'd lost. "I'll help with the glass," Trace said to Hallie, and she gave him a grateful look. As they worked together, sweeping up the shards and wiping the spilled whiskey from the floor, Trace found himself studying the room more carefully. The furniture was simple but well made, built to last. Photographs lined the mantella, younger Samuel, in his trail boss days. A beautiful woman who could only be Hallie's mother, family gatherings that spoke of happier times. On the wall hung a coiled rope and a pair of spurs, polished to a shine that suggested they were cherished reminders of better days. 23 years, Samuel said suddenly, as if continuing a conversation they'd been having. 23 years, I ran cattle through here. Never lost a man, never lost a herd. Not until—" he stopped, his hands clenching into fists. "Not until I did." "Pa," Hallie said gently, but he wasn't listening. "3 good men," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger with pain. "Tom Bradley, just 19, had a girl waiting for him in San Antonio. And old Pete Garrison, been riding with me for 15 years. And Charlie," his voice broke. "Charlie was just a boy, 16 years old, and his mother trusted me to bring him home." The room fell silent except for the wind outside and the soft tick of a clock on the mantel. Trace had heard similar stories before: the weight of command, the burden of responsibility, the way a single bad decision could haunt a man for the rest of his life. But hearing it from Samuel Cooper, seeing the way it had broken him, made it fresh and immediate. "Weather turned without warning," Samuel said, his eyes focused on something none of them could see. "Blue Norther came down like the wrath of God. Cattle started to drift, and I had to choose: let them go, or risk the men trying to hold them. I chose the cattle." He looked up at Trace then, his eyes clear for the first time since they'd entered the house. "I chose wrong." Trace met his gaze steadily. "You made the choice you thought was right at the time. That's all any man can do." "Is it?" Samuel asked. "Because I've been thinking about it for 4 years now, and I can't figure out how saving 1,000 head of beef was worth 3 good men." "It wasn't," Trace said simply, "but losing yourself to guilt won't bring them back." The words hung in the air between them, honest and hard and necessary. Samuel stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "Doesn't make it any easier, but you're right." He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and Trace saw love there beneath the pain. "I'm sorry, girl. I know this isn't what you deserve." "Pa," Hallie said, her voice thick with emotion, "you're what I deserve. You're my father, and I love you. The rest will figure out the rest." Samuel reached out and touched her face with a trembling hand. "You're so much like your mother, strong where I'm weak, brave where I'm cowardly. I don't know what I did to deserve you." "You loved her," Hallie said simply, "and you loved me. That's enough." Trace felt like an intruder in this moment of family intimacy, but he also understood that sometimes healing required a witness. He busied himself with the last of the broken glass, giving them space while staying close enough to offer support if needed. "Mr. Morgan," Samuel said finally, "I appreciate your help, but I should warn you, staying here might not be safe. We've got troubles coming, and I'd hate to see you caught up in them." "What kind of troubles?" Trace asked, though he thought he could guess. "The kind that come with papers and lawyers and men who don't take no for an answer," Samuel said. "The kind that end with good people losing everything they've worked for." Trace nodded, understanding. The frontier was changing, and not always for the better. Small ranchers were being squeezed out by bigger operations, by railroad companies, by men who saw land as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. "Well," Trace said, settling back on his heels, "I reckon I'll stay anyway. Sometimes a man needs to take a stand, even if it's not his fight." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're welcome here, Mr. Morgan. More welcome than you know." Outside, the wind was picking up, and Trace could smell snow in the air. The storm was coming, just as he'd predicted, but inside this small house, something else was stirring, the first faint warmth of hope, fragile as a candle flame but burning steady. As Hallie moved around the kitchen, preparing a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Trace found himself watching her with growing admiration. She moved with quiet efficiency, her hands skilled at the domestic tasks that kept a household running. But there was more to her than that, a strength that came from the bone, a determination that spoke of someone who'd learned early that the world wouldn't give you anything you weren't willing to fight for. She caught him looking and smiled, a small expression that transformed her face from merely pretty to something approaching beautiful. "Supper won't be much," she said, "but you're welcome to what we have." "I'm grateful," Trace said, and meant it. He'd eaten in fancy restaurants and hotel dining rooms, but there was something about sharing a simple meal with people who'd opened their home to a stranger that felt like luxury. As they sat around the table, the lamp casting a warm circle of light in the growing darkness, Trace felt the compass in his pocket settle into stillness. For the first time in 6 years, he wasn't thinking about the next town or the next job. He was thinking about tomorrow and the work that needed to be done, and the woman across from him who'd somehow made a broken-down ranch feel like the place he'd been looking for all his life. The storm was coming, but inside this house, around this table, there was warmth and purpose and the beginning of something that might be called family. And for a man who'd been running from attachment for 6 long years, that was both the most frightening and the most hopeful thing he could imagine. The morning came grey and cold, with the promise of snow heavy in the air. Trace had spent the night in the barn, listening to the wind test the loose boards, and thinking about the woman in the house who was trying to hold together something that seemed determined to fall apart. He'd slept better than he had in months, maybe because for the first time in years he'd fallen asleep with a purpose for the next day. He was splitting wood behind the house when he heard the horses coming. 3 riders, moving at a deliberate pace that spoke of business rather than pleasure. Trace set down the axe and moved to where he could see the front of the house, his hand instinctively checking the position of his colt. The lead rider was a tall, thin man in a black coat that had seen better days. His face was sharp and angular, with eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. The 2 men flanking him were clearly hired muscle, the kind of men who asked no questions and forgot whatever they were told to forget. Hallie emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Even from a distance, Trace could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself ready for trouble. She'd been expecting this visit, he realized. The question was how long she'd been dreading it. "Miss Cooper," the man in black called out, touching his hat with mock courtesy. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Though I do believe we're in for some weather." "Mr. Blackwood," Hallie replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "What brings you out here so early?" Ezra Blackwood dismounted with the careful movements of a man who spent more time behind a desk than in the saddle. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, the paper crackling in the cold air. "I'm afraid I bring unpleasant news, Miss Cooper. This notice of foreclosure has been filed with the county clerk. Your father's debts have reached a point where action must be taken." Samuel Cooper appeared in the doorway then, swaying slightly but apparently sober. His face was pale, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been the night before. "How much?" he asked quietly. $500, Blackwood said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man delivering a death blow. "Plus, interest and fees, of course. Call it 600 total." The sum hung in the air like a curse. Trace had worked cattle drives that paid a man $30 a month, and that was good money. $600 might as well have been 6,000 for a family barely scraping by. "When?" Samuel asked. 30 days, Blackwood replied, consulting the document with theatrical precision. "After that, the property will be sold at auction to satisfy the debt." Hallie's face had gone white, but her voice remained steady. "What if we can raise part of it? Would you consider a payment plan?" Blackwood's smile was as cold as the wind. "I'm afraid the creditors aren't interested in partial payments, Miss Cooper. They want full satisfaction, and they want it promptly." "And if we can't pay?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll need to find somewhere else to live," Blackwood said with false sympathy, "though I understand there are rooms available in town. Nothing fancy, of course, but suitable for people in your circumstances." Trace had heard enough. He stepped around the corner of the house, his movement deliberate and unhurried. All 3 men turned to look at him, and he saw Blackwood's eyes narrow with calculation. "Gentlemen," Trace said, nodding politely, "fine morning for a ride." "And you are?" Blackwood asked, his tone suggesting that Trace's presence was an unwelcome complication. "Trace Morgan. I'm helping the Coopers with some repairs." He moved to stand beside Hallie, close enough to offer support, but not so close as to suggest anything improper. One of Blackwood's men, a thick-set brute with scarred knuckles, looked Trace up and down with professional interest. Just passing through, or planning to stay? There was a challenge in the question, and Trace met it with calm directness. "Depends on how much work there is to be done." Blackwood stepped forward, his smile widening. "I wouldn't get too attached to the place, Mr. Morgan. As I was just explaining to Miss Cooper, the property will be changing hands very soon." 30 days, Trace said, not making it a question. 30 days, Blackwood confirmed. "Unless, of course, the debt is satisfied. But between you and me," he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper, "I don't see how that's possible." Samuel's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, Trace saw a flash of the man he used to beat trail boss, who'd commanded respect from hardened cowboys. "This ranch has been in my family for 23 years, he said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. "And it's a fine ranch," Blackwood agreed smoothly, "which is why it will sell quickly once it goes to auction. I'm sure the new owners will appreciate its potential." The emphasis on new owners was deliberate, and Trace caught the implication. Blackwood wasn't just collecting a debt, was orchestrating the ranch's sale, probably to buyers he'd already lined up. "Might I ask who holds the note?" Trace inquired politely. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "That's a matter of public record, Mr. Morgan, available at the courthouse for anyone interested enough to make the trip." "I might just do that," Trace said, and something in his tone made Blackwood's eyes sharpen. "You do that," Blackwood replied, "though I should mention that the road to town can be dangerous this time of year. Storms come up suddenly, and a man can find himself in all sorts of trouble if he's not careful." The threat was politely worded, but unmistakable. Trace smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate the warning. Though I've been riding dangerous roads most of my life, they don't worry me much anymore." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, each taking the other's measure. Finally, Blackwood folded the foreclosure notice and handed it to Hallie. 30 days, Miss Cooper. I do hope you'll use the time wisely." He remounted his horse with the same careful movements, his men following suit. As they prepared to leave, the scarred man leaned down toward Trace. "Friendly advice, Cowboy," he said quietly. "This ain't your fight. Might be healthier if you remembered that." "I'll keep it in mind," Trace replied, his tone conversational, "though I've never been particularly good at remembering advice." The men rode away without looking back, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the approaching storm. Hallie stood frozen, the foreclosure notice crumpled in her hands, while Samuel slumped against the doorframe, as if the brief show of strength had exhausted him. $600, Hallie whispered, staring at the paper as if she could make the numbers change by force of will. "We don't have $600, Samuel said flatly. "We don't have $60. Trace studied the retreating riders, noting the way they moved with the confidence of men who believed they held all the cards. "Tell me about Blackwood," he said. "Land agent," Samuel replied bitterly. "Showed up about 2 years ago. Started buying up properties for development. Railroad's coming through, and he's been snapping up parcels along the proposed route." "For the railroad?" "Claims to be," Hallie said, her voice hollow. "But there are rumors he's working for himself, planning to resell at a profit once the tracks are laid." Trace nodded, pieces of a familiar pattern falling into place. He'd seen it before in other town speculators, moving ahead of progress, using legal technicalities and strong-arm tactics to force out long-time residents. "The debt," he said. "How much of it is legitimate?" Samuel's face reddened with shame. "Most of it. I borrowed against the ranch when the cattle market went bad, then borrowed more to cover the first loans. The drinking didn't help, made some poor decisions, trusted the wrong people." "But $600, Trace pressed. "Started at 300, Hallie said quietly. "But the interest and penalties, they compound every month." Mr. Blackwood was very helpful in explaining how quickly debt can grow. "I'll bet he was." Trace walked to where his horse stood, tethered, thinking hard. He had some money saved, maybe $200, but that wouldn't be nearly enough. And even if he could raise the full amount, it would only be a temporary solution. Men like Blackwood didn't give up easily. "What are you thinking?" Hallie asked, following him. Trace looked at her, really looked at her. The morning light revealed the fine lines of worry around her eyes, the way she held herself, as if expecting another blow. But it also showed her strength, the steel beneath the softness that had kept this family together when everything else was falling apart. "I'm thinking 30 days is a long time," he said finally. "A lot can happen in 30 days. "Like what?" Samuel asked, genuine curiosity cutting through his despair. "Like finding out who really holds that note and what Blackwood's real game is," Trace replied. "Like maybe discovering that not all of that debt is as legitimate as it appears." Hope flickered in Hallie's eyes, fragile but unmistakable. "You think there might be a way?" "I think," Trace said carefully, "that men like Blackwood usually make enemies, and sometimes those enemies are willing to help when the situation's right." He moved to the woodpile and picked up the axe again, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "But first things first, we've got a roof to fix and wood to split. Storm's coming, and whatever else happens, you'll want to be ready for it." Samuel straightened, something in Trace's tone calling to the man he used to be. "What can I do?" "You can help me understand exactly how this debt accumulated," Trace said. "Every loan, every payment, every dealing you've had with Blackwood or his associates. If we're going to fight this, we need to know the battlefield." "Fight?" Hallie asked, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Hope, maybe, or just the possibility of hope. Trace met her eyes, seeing his own determination reflected there. "Fight," he confirmed. "This is your home, your family's legacy. Some things are worth fighting for." As if in response to his words, the first snowflakes began to fall, drifting down from the grey sky like cold promises. The storm was coming, just as Blackwood had warned, but Trace had faced storms before. And sometimes, he'd learned, the worst weather brought the clearest thinking. He hefted the axe and turned back to the woodpile, but his mind was already working on the problem Blackwood represented. 30 days wasn't long, but it might be enough. It would have to be enough. Behind him, he heard Hallie folding the foreclosure notice with careful precision, as if handling it gently might lessen its power. Then her footsteps moved toward the house, purposeful and determined. "Pa," she said, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there an hour before. "Let's make some coffee, we've got planning to do." Samuel looked at his daughter, then at the stranger who'd somehow become their champion, and for the first time in months, he smiled. "Yes," he said, straightening his shoulders. "I believe we do." The snow was falling harder now, but inside the house, something warm was beginning to kindle, not just hope, but the will to fight for what mattered. And sometimes, Trace reflected as he split another log, that was all a man needed to start changing the odds. The storm lasted 3 days, giving Trace time to settle into the rhythm of the Cooper Ranch and begin understanding the depth of their troubles. He'd moved his gear into the barn's tack room, a small space that smelled of leather and hay and honest work. It wasn't much, but it felt more like home than any hotel room he'd occupied in the past 6 years. Samuel's trail boss badge sat on the kitchen table like an accusation, tarnished silver that caught the lamplight and threw it back in fractured pieces. Hallie had found it in her father's old saddlebags while searching for papers related to the ranch's finances, and Samuel had stared at it for a long time without speaking. "I earned that in Abilene," he said finally, his fingers tracing the raised letters that spelled out "Trail Boss" beneath a longhorn skull. "Took a herd through that nobody else would touch half-wild Mexican cattle with horns like cavalry sabers. But we got them through, every last head." Trace examined the badge, noting the careful craftsmanship and the weight of real silver. "That's something to be proud of." "Was," Samuel corrected, "before I let pride and whiskey turn me into something else." They were sitting around the kitchen table, papers spread between them like pieces of a puzzle they were trying to solve. The documents told a story of gradual decline, missed payments, accumulated interest, desperate borrowing against future hopes. But there was something else, patterns that suggested more than simple misfortune. "This loan here," Trace said, pointing to a particular document. "When did you negotiate this one?" Samuel squinted at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. "Last spring, I think, after the hard winter killed off half the herd. Blackwood said it was just a bridge loan, something to carry us through until cattle prices improved." Hallie leaned closer, her shoulder brushing Trace's as she studied the document. The interest rate seems high. 20%? Blackwood said it was standard for high-risk loans, Samuel replied, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Trace had seen similar documents before, usually in the hands of men who made their living off other people's desperation. Standard for loan sharks, maybe. Not for legitimate banking. You think he cheated us? Hallie asked, hope and anger warring in her voice. I think he took advantage of a difficult situation, Trace said carefully. Whether that amounts to cheating depends on what the law says about usury in this county. Through the window, he could see the snow still falling, adding to the drifts that already reached halfway up the fence posts. The storm had isolated them completely, which meant Blackwood's men weren't likely to be watching the ranch. It also meant that any trip to town to research the legal situation would have to wait. Tell me about the other ranches, Trace said. Blackwood mentioned that several properties were being acquired for development. Samuel's face darkened. The Hendersons lost their place 6 months ago. Bill Henderson had been ranching that land for 15 years, but got behind on payments during the drought. Blackwood swooped in like a vulture. Where are they now? Bill works at the feed store in town. Sarah Henderson takes in washing. Their oldest boy joined the army rather than watch his family struggle. Samuel's voice carried the weight of a man who saw his own future in his neighbor's fate. Hallie stood and moved to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared out at the white landscape. The Morrison place went up for auction last month, and the Crawfords are talking about selling before they're forced out. How many families total? Trace asked. 7, maybe 8, depending on how you count the smaller spreads, Samuel replied. All good people, all facing the same squeeze. Trace leaned back in his chair, the wooden joints creaking under his weight. The pattern was becoming clearer: systematic pressure applied to multiple properties, using legal but questionable methods to force sales. It was efficient, profitable, and completely ruthless. Has anyone tried organizing resistance, collective action? Samuel shook his head. Bill Henderson talked about it before he lost his place, but nobody had the money to fight. Lawyers cost more than most of us see in a year. Besides, Hallie added, still looking out at the storm, Blackwood has the law on his side. Sheriff Garrett won't act against him without clear evidence of wrongdoing. And Sheriff Garrett is? Honest enough, Samuel said, but careful about stepping on important toes. Blackwood's got connections in the county seat, maybe even the state capital. Trace stood and joined Hallie at the window. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way, white and pure and seemingly endless. But beneath that beauty lay the hard reality of frontier life, the constant struggle against weather, economics, and men who saw opportunity in other people's misfortune. What about your neighbors? He asked. The ones still hanging on? The Mitchells have been good friends, Hallie said. Tom Mitchell was one of Pa's riders before he started his own spread, and the Carlsons would help if they could, but they're barely holding on themselves. Still, Trace mused, neighbors helping neighbors. That's how things get done out here. Samuel looked up from the papers, interest sparking in his tired eyes. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Blackwood's been picking you off one at a time because that's the easiest way, Trace replied. But if the remaining ranchers stood together, presented a united front, we still wouldn't have the money to pay off all the debts, Hallie pointed out. No, Trace agreed, but we might have enough collective influence to demand an investigation into Blackwood's methods. And sometimes, when men like him know they're being watched, they make mistakes. The idea was taking shape in his mind, still rough but gaining substance. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be safe, but it might be their only chance. You're talking about taking on some powerful interests, Samuel warned. Men who have a lot to lose if their schemes are exposed. I'm talking about fighting for what's right, Trace replied. Sometimes that's the only choice a man has. Samuel picked up his trail boss badge, turning it over in his weathered hands. I used to believe that, before I learned how much a man can lose when he makes the wrong choice. You didn't make the wrong choice, Trace said firmly. You made the choice you thought was right at the time, under impossible circumstances. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper. No, Hallie said, turning from the window to face her father. It isn't. The wrong choice would have been to let the cattle drift and do nothing. The wrong choice would have been to stay safe while your men were in danger. Samuel looked at his daughter, seeing perhaps for the first time the strength she'd inherited from both her parents. When did you get so wise? I had good teachers, she replied simply. The moment stretched between them, father and daughter finding their way back to each other across the gulf that grief and guilt had created. Trace felt like an intruder, but he also understood that healing sometimes required witnesses. Outside, the wind was beginning to die down, and the snow was falling less heavily. The storm was passing, which meant decisions would need to be made soon. I'll need to get to town as soon as the roads are clear, Trace said. Research those loan documents, maybe talk to some of the other families who've been affected. I'll come with you, Hallie said immediately. Hallie, Samuel started to protest. I'll come with you, she repeated, her tone brooking no argument. This is my fight too. Trace nodded, recognizing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. We'll need to be careful. Blackwood's men won't appreciate us stirring up trouble. Let them try to stop us, Hallie said, and for a moment she sounded so much like her father in his prime that Samuel smiled despite everything. All right then, Samuel said, pinning the trail boss badge to his shirt with deliberate ceremony. If we're going to fight, we might as well do it right. Trace felt the compass in his vest pocket, its weight familiar and reassuring. The needle had been pointing steadily in the same direction for 3 days now, towards something that felt increasingly like purpose. 27 days left, and the real work was just beginning. The roads were still treacherous when Trace and Hallie set out for town, but the storm had passed, and the sun was making a valiant effort to break through the grey clouds. Trace had saddled Buck, while Hallie prepared her own mount, a sturdy mare named Rosie, who had the steady temperament of a horse that had learned to trust her rider completely. Before they left, Hallie had gone to her room and returned with something clutched in her hand. She didn't show it to Trace, but he caught the glint of gold when she tucked it into her coat pocket, something precious that she was willing to risk for the chance of saving their home. You don't have to come, Trace said as they guided their horses carefully down the icy slope leading away from the ranch. Yes, I do, Hallie replied, her voice steady despite the cold wind. This is my family's legacy we're fighting for. I won't hide behind someone else's courage. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, their horses picking their way carefully through the snow-covered landscape. The world seemed crystalline and pure, as if the storm had washed away all the complications and left only the essential beauty of the land itself. Tell me about the woman you lost, Hallie said suddenly, her words visible as puffs of vapor in the cold air. Trace was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully preserved pain. Her name was Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. We were engaged to be married. He paused, adjusting his grip on the reins. She got sick the winter before our wedding. Consumption. I stayed with her until the end, but there wasn't anything I could do except watch her fade away. I'm sorry, Hallie said simply. I blamed myself for a long time, Trace continued. Thought if I'd been a better man, worked harder, saved more money, maybe I could have taken her somewhere with better doctors. Maybe I could have saved her. But you couldn't have, Hallie said gently. No, Trace agreed. But it took me a long time to accept that. Too long, maybe. He looked at her then, his eyes serious. I've been running from attachment ever since, telling myself it was safer to be alone. And now I'm thinking that maybe the safest place isn't always the right place. They reached the main road, where other travelers had packed down the snow into a navigable path. The going was easier here, and they made better time toward town. What's in your pocket? Trace asked. Hallie's hand moved instinctively to the bulge in her coat. My mother's engagement ring. She left it to me when she died, said it was for when I found the right man. She looked straight ahead, not meeting his eyes. I thought maybe the jeweler might give us something for it. Hallie. I know it won't be enough, she said quickly, but every dollar helps, and it's just sitting in my jewelry box doing nothing. Trace pulled Buck to a stop, forcing Hallie to rein in beside him. "That ring is your inheritance. Your mother meant for you to wear it, not sell it." "My mother meant for me to be happy," Hallie replied. "And I can't be happy if I lose everything she and my father built together." The logic was unassailable, but it still felt wrong to Trace. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. "This was Sarah's ring," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a modest diamond. "I've been carrying it for 6 years, telling myself I was honoring her memory. But maybe I was just using it as an excuse to avoid living." Hallie stared at the ring, understanding the significance of what he was showing her. "Trace. The point is," he said, closing the box and returning it to his pocket, "some things are worth more than their cash value. Your mother's ring is part of your story, part of who you are. We'll find another way." They resumed riding, the town visible now as a collection of buildings clustered around the railroad tracks that were still under construction. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and even from a distance they could see people moving about their daily business. "The bank first?" Hallie asked. "The courthouse," Trace replied. "I want to see those loan documents and find out exactly who holds the paper on your ranch." The courthouse was a substantial brick building that projected the authority of law and order. Inside, they found a clerk who was helpful enough once Trace explained they were researching property records for a potential purchase. The documents were more revealing than Trace had hoped. Samuel's original loans had been legitimate, taken out with the First Bank of Cedar Creek at reasonable interest rates. But those loans had been sold and resold, eventually ending up in the hands of a company called Panhandle Development Corporation. "Never heard of them," the clerk said when Trace asked. "But a lot of these development companies are just paper entities, set up to hold property and loans." "Who are the principals?" "Let me check." The clerk disappeared into the back room and returned with a thick ledger. "Panhandle Development Corporation, incorporated in Austin last year. Principal officers listed as E. J. Blackwood, President, and Marcus Kincaid, Vice President." Trace made note of the names. Kincaid was new to him, but the fact that Blackwood was officially involved in the company that held Samuel's debt suggested a conflict of interest at minimum. "What about the interest rates on the transferred loans?" Hallie asked. The clerk consulted the documents again. "Looks like they were modified when the loans were transferred. Original rate was 8%, current rate is 20%. "Is that legal?" Trace asked. "Depends on the terms of the original loan agreement," the clerk said with a shrug. "Though 20% does seem high for secured debt." They spent another hour reviewing documents, building a picture of systematic acquisition that painted Blackwood and his associates in an increasingly unfavorable light. When they finally left the courthouse, Trace's mind was working furiously. "What now?" Hallie asked. "Now we visit the bank and see what they can tell us about these loan transfers," Trace replied. "And then we start talking to your neighbors about organizing some resistance." The First Bank of Cedar Creek was a modest establishment that radiated small-town stability. The president, a middle-aged man named James Harrison, received them in his office and listened carefully to their questions. "The Cooper loan was one of several we sold last year," Harrison admitted. "The decision wasn't popular with me, but the bank's board felt it was necessary to improve our liquidity position." "Who approached you about buying the loans?" Trace asked. "Blackwood, representing Panhandle Development," Harrison replied. "Offered to purchase several of our problem loans at face value, which seemed like a good deal at the time." "Problem loans?" "Loans where the borrowers were having difficulty making payments," Harrison explained. "We thought selling them would be better for everyone. The bank would get its money back, and the new holders might be more flexible with the borrowers." "Has that proven to be the case?" Hallie asked quietly. Harrison's expression darkened. "No, it hasn't. If anything, the new company has been more aggressive about collection than we ever were." They talked for another few minutes, but it was clear that Harrison was genuinely remorseful about the loan sales and had no useful information about Blackwood's broader plans. Outside the bank, Trace and Hallie stood in the cold afternoon air, processing what they'd learned. So Blackwood positioned himself as a helpful buyer of problem loans, then raised the interest rates and accelerated the collection process, Hallie summarized. Which is probably legal, if the loan agreements allowed for modification upon transfer, Trace replied. But it's definitely predatory. What's our next move? Trace looked around the town, noting the signs of growth and development, new buildings under construction, surveyors' marks on empty lots, the bustle of a community expecting prosperity. We talked to Tom Mitchell and the other ranchers, he said, and we start building a case that Blackwood's methods, while perhaps technically legal, are contrary to the community's best interests. As they walked back to their horses, Trace felt the weight of Sarah's ring in his pocket and thought about the conversation they'd had on the ride into town. For 6 years he'd been carrying that ring like a talisman against future pain, but maybe it was time to let it serve a different purpose. Maybe it was time to stop running from the possibility of love and start running toward it instead. 25 days left, and the real fight was just beginning. The bottle sat on the kitchen table like a test of Samuel Cooper's resolve. It was the last bottle of whiskey in the house, discovered hidden behind preserving jars in the root cellar when Hallie was looking for pickled vegetables to serve with dinner. Samuel stared at it now, his hands trembling slightly, while Trace and Hallie pretended not to notice his internal struggle. Tom Mitchell will be here within the hour, Hallie said, checking the clock on the mantel, and the Carlsons said they'd try to make it if the roads aren't too bad. They were planning the first meeting of what Trace had started calling the Panhandle Ranchers Association, an unofficial organization designed to coordinate resistance to Blackwood's schemes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Samuel reached for the bottle, then stopped, his hand hovering inches from the glass. "I used to be good at this," he said quietly. "Leading men, making plans, seeing a way through difficult situations." "You still are," Trace replied. "You just need to remember how." "Do I?" Samuel's voice carried years of self-doubt. "Because right now, I can't see any way through this that doesn't end with us losing everything." Trace moved to the window, watching for approaching riders. The afternoon was clear but cold, with the kind of brilliant winter sunlight that made the snow-covered landscape look like something from a Christmas card. But beneath the beauty lay the harsh reality of their situation. 15 days left to raise $600 or lose everything. "Maybe losing isn't the worst thing that could happen," Trace said thoughtfully. Both Coopers looked at him in surprise. "I don't mean giving up," he clarified quickly. "I mean accepting that even if we lose this particular battle, we don't have to lose the war." Samuel frowned. "I don't follow." "Blackwood's operation depends on secrecy and intimidation," Trace explained. "He picks off isolated targets, uses legal technicalities to force sales, then resells the properties at a profit. But what if his methods became public knowledge? What if potential buyers knew they were purchasing land taken from families through questionable means?" Hallie's eyes brightened with understanding. "You're talking about fighting back in the court of public opinion." "Among other things," Trace agreed. "Blackwood's power comes from operating in shadow. If we can drag his methods into the light, we might not save the ranch, but we could prevent him from doing this to other families." Samuel finished, and for the first time in days there was something like hope in his voice. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Trace could see 2 riders approaching, a man and woman on sturdy ranch horses, moving with the easy confidence of people who belonged on horseback. "That'll be Tom and Mary Mitchell," Hallie said, moving toward the door. Tom Mitchell was a compact man, with graying hair and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. His wife Mary was a small, determined woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of direct manner that came from years of frontier living. They'd ridden over from their ranch despite roads that were still treacherous in places. "Samuel," Tom said, gripping his old friend's hand. "Good to see you up and around." "Tom, Mary," Samuel replied, and Trace noted that he stood a little straighter, spoke a little clearer, in the presence of his neighbors. "I appreciate you coming." "Wouldn't miss it," Mary said firmly. "What Blackwood's doing to folks around here is criminal, even if the law says otherwise." They gathered around the kitchen table. The whiskey bottle moved to a side counter where it couldn't dominate the conversation. Trace outlined what they'd learned about Blackwood's methods, while Hallie served coffee and the kind of simple food that somehow tasted better when shared among friends. "So he's been systematically targeting ranchers who are struggling," Tom said, his jaw tightening, "buying up their debts and then squeezing them until they're forced to sell." "That's about the size of it," Trace confirmed. "And from what we could determine, he's got buyers lined up, probably railroad interests, looking to acquire land along the proposed route." Mary Mitchell leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. "The Henderson place sold for how much?" "Auction brought $300, Samuel replied, "for land that should have been worth at least $1,000. And I'll bet Blackwood had a buyer ready to purchase it from the auction winner for considerably more," Trace added. "So what do we do about it?" Tom asked. "None of us have the money to outbid him at auction, and hiring lawyers is beyond our means. We start by documenting everything," Trace said. "Every family he's targeted, every questionable loan modification, every below-market sale. We build a case that shows a pattern of predatory behavior." "And then what?" Mary asked. "Who's going to listen to a bunch of struggling ranchers?" "The territorial governor, for one," Trace replied, "and the railroad commission. If Blackwood is manipulating land sales along the proposed rail route, that's something they'll want to know about." Samuel had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "There's something else. Something I haven't told anyone." He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "The cattle drive where I lost those men, it wasn't just bad weather that killed them." The room fell silent. Hallie reached out and touched her father's hand, offering silent support. "There was another man with us," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "A buyer's agent named Kincaid, Marcus Kincaid. He was supposed to take delivery of the herd in Kansas, but when the storm hit, he insisted we keep moving rather than seek shelter." Trace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Kincaid? Marcus Kincaid? You know the name?" "He's listed as Vice President of Panhandle Development Corporation," Trace said grimly. "Blackwood's partner." Samuel's face went pale. "That can't be a coincidence." "No," Trace agreed, "it can't. Tell me more about what happened on that drive." Samuel took a deep breath, clearly gathering himself for a painful recounting. "The storm came down fast, like they do on the plains. I wanted to find shelter, let it blow over. But Kincaid said the buyers were waiting, that delays would cost money. He offered a bonus if we could get the herd through on schedule." "So you kept moving," Tom said quietly. "Against my better judgment, yes. The cattle were getting spooked. The men were having trouble controlling them. But Kincaid kept pushing, saying a little weather shouldn't stop experienced cowboys." "What happened to Kincaid when the men died?" Trace asked. "That's the strange thing," Samuel said, his brow furrowing with memory. "He disappeared during the worst of the storm. Said he was riding ahead to scout the trail, but we never saw him again. Found out later he'd made it to town safely, while my men were dying in the blizzard." Mary Mitchell's eyes flashed with anger. "So he pressured you into taking risks, then abandoned you when things went bad?" "And left me to carry the blame," Samuel confirmed. "I've been thinking about that night for 4 years, wondering if I made the right choice. But now you're wondering if you were deliberately set up," Trace finished. The implications were staggering. If Kincaid had intentionally pressured Samuel into taking dangerous risks, knowing that failure would destroy his reputation and financial stability, then the current foreclosure action might be the culmination of a years-long plan. "But why?" Hallie asked. "What would be the point of ruining my father deliberately?" "Land," Tom said grimly. "This ranch sits right in the path of the proposed railroad. If they could acquire it cheaply, they'd stand to make a fortune when the tracks come through," Trace finished. Samuel stood abruptly and walked to the side counter where the whiskey bottle waited. For a moment, everyone held their breath, waiting to see what he would do. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he picked up the bottle and poured its contents into the sink, watching the amber liquid swirl down the drain. "I'm done hiding from what happened," he said, his voice strong and clear. If Kincaid and Blackwood think they can destroy my family to line their own pockets, they're about to learn different. The transformation was remarkable. The broken man who'd been drowning his sorrows just days before was gone, replaced by someone who looked very much like the trail boss Samuel Cooper had once been. "What do you need from us?" Mary asked. "Help spreading the word," Trace replied. "Every family in the area needs to know what they're up against, and we need to find other victims, people who've had dealings with Kincaid or Blackwood in the past." "I can handle that," Tom said. "Mary and I know most of the ranchers in 3 counties. "What about the law?" Hallie asked. "Sheriff Garrett might listen if we present him with enough evidence." "Maybe," Trace said, though he sounded doubtful. "But I suspect Blackwood's made sure he has friends in the sheriff's office. We'll need to be careful who we trust." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses reached them from outside. But these riders were moving fast, and there were too many of them for social visitors. Trace moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 6 men, he reported. Blackwood in the lead. "They're early," Samuel said grimly. "Wasn't supposed to hear from them for another 2 weeks." "Maybe they know we've been asking questions in town," Hallie suggested. Trace checked his gun, making sure it was loose in its holster. "Tom, you and Mary might want to stay inside. This could get unpleasant." But Tom Mitchell was already standing, his own hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "With respect, Trace, this is our fight too. If Blackwood wants to intimidate our neighbors, he'll have to go through all of us." Through the window, they could see the riders forming a loose semicircle in front of the house. Blackwood sat his horse in the center, his black coat making him look like a crow among the snow. His men were spread out to either side, their positions suggesting they were ready for trouble. "Samuel Cooper," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I think we need to have another conversation." Samuel moved toward the door, but Trace caught his arm. "Let me handle this." "This is my ranch," Samuel replied, gently but firmly pulling free. "My family, my responsibility." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, Trace close behind him. The others followed, presenting a united front that clearly wasn't what Blackwood had expected. "Mr. Blackwood," Samuel said, his voice steady and strong. "You're a long way from town. What brings you out here on such a cold day?" Blackwood's smile was cold as the wind. "I hear you've been making inquiries about my business affairs, Cooper, asking questions that don't concern you." "Anything that affects my family concerns me," Samuel replied. "Your family," Blackwood repeated, his gaze moving to include Hallie, Trace, and the Mitchells. "Yes, I can see you've been expanding your circle of friends. I hope they understand what they're getting themselves into." The threat was clear, but Tom Mitchell stepped forward without hesitation. "We understand just fine, Blackwood. The question is whether you understand what you're up against." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied the group on the porch. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm simply a businessman trying to collect legitimate debts. There's no need for this to become unpleasant." "Then maybe you should explain why those debts keep growing every month," Trace said quietly, "and why the interest rates were modified without the borrower's knowledge." For the first time, Blackwood looked genuinely surprised. "You've been busy, haven't you, Mr. Morgan?" "Just looking out for my neighbors," Trace replied. Blackwood studied them for a long moment, then turned his horse slightly so he could address Samuel directly. "You have 11 days, Cooper. 11 days to come up with $600, or this property goes to auction. I'd strongly suggest you use that time wisely, rather than chasing conspiracy theories." "And I'd suggest you make sure all your paperwork is in order," Samuel replied, "because we intend to examine every document, every transaction, every claim you've made." Blackwood's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "Be very careful, Cooper. All of you. This country can be a dangerous place for people who don't know their place." With that, he wheeled his horse around and led his men away from the ranch, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken threats. "Well," Mary Mitchell said finally, "I'd say we got his attention. The question is," Tom added grimly, "what's he going to do about it?" 11 days left, and the stakes had just gotten considerably higher. The locket lay open on Hallie's palm, revealing the faded photograph of her parents on their wedding day. Samuel looked young and confident in the picture, his arm around a beautiful woman whose eyes sparkled with joy and hope. It was hard to reconcile that image with the broken man who'd spent 4 years drowning in whiskey and regret. "They look so happy," Trace observed, standing close enough to Hallie that he could smell the lavender soap she used in her hair. "They were," Hallie said softly. "Pa used to say that marrying Ma was the smartest thing he ever did. She could gentle a wild horse, deliver a calf, and make a feast out of nothing. And she could make him laugh, even when the world seemed determined to beat them down." The past few days had brought a subtle shift in the relationship between Hallie and Trace. They worked together with an easy rhythm now, their movements coordinated like partners in a dance they'd been practicing for years. The attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface was becoming harder to ignore, especially in quiet moments like this. "Tell me about her," Trace said, genuinely interested. "She was from back east originally, Boston, I think, though she never talked much about her family there. Came west as a schoolteacher and met Pa at a church social." Hallie smiled at the memory. "He said it took him 3 months to work up the courage to ask her to dance, and another 2 months to propose. Smart woman, to see past the rough exterior to the man underneath. She always said that the best men were like good horses. Sometimes they needed patient handling to bring out their true nature." Hallie closed the locket with a soft click. "I think that's why she never gave up on Pa, even when the drinking got bad. She could see the man he used to be, the man he could be again." They were standing in the barn, where Trace had been working on repairing a broken stall door. The work was almost finished, just like the man himself, Trace reflected. 3 weeks at the Cooper Ranch had changed him in ways he was still discovering. "What about you?" Hallie asked. "Do you think people can really change?" Trace set down his hammer and considered the question. "I think people can choose to become who they're meant to be, instead of who their circumstances have made them, but it takes courage. And the right motivation? That too." He looked at her directly, no longer trying to hide what was in his eyes. "Sometimes a man needs something worth fighting for." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and promise. Hallie took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Trace, I..." The sound of approaching horses shattered the intimate moment. But these weren't the aggressive riders they'd encountered before. Tom Mitchell was returning, and he wasn't alone. 3 other men rode with him, their faces grim with purpose. "Trouble," Trace muttered, recognizing the look of men bringing bad news. They hurried outside to meet the riders. In addition to Tom, there was Bill Henderson Rancher, who'd already lost his property to Blackwood, and 2 other men Trace didn't recognize. "Samuel," Tom called out as the older man emerged from the house. "We need to talk, all of us." They gathered in the kitchen once again, the room that had become their unofficial headquarters. Bill Henderson looked older than his years, his face marked by the stress of losing everything he'd worked for. "Tell them what you told me, Bill," Tom said without preamble. Henderson cleared his throat, his hands nervously turning his hat brim. "It's about Kincaid, Marcus Kincaid. Tom says you had dealings with him?" "On the cattle drive where I lost 3 men, Samuel confirmed. "Why?" "Because he approached me too about 6 months before I lost my ranch. Said he represented Eastern investors who were looking to buy cattle futures. Offered me a good price for my spring herd, payment in advance." Trace felt a chill of recognition. "Let me guess, the deal went bad somehow." "Worse than bad," Henderson said bitterly. "Kincaid's money turned out to be borrowed against my own ranch as collateral. When the cattle market dropped, I couldn't deliver the herd at the agreed price, and suddenly I owed more money than I'd ever seen." "The same pattern," Hallie breathed. "Create a situation where you're guaranteed to fail, then profit from the failure." "It gets worse," said one of the other men, Jake Morrison, whose family was facing their own foreclosure. "Kincaid approached me last year with a deal to provide horses for a government contract. Said it was a sure thing, guaranteed profit. Turned out the contract was fake." "And you borrowed money to buy the horses?" Trace guessed. "Every cent I could raise," Morrison confirmed. When the contract fell through, I was left with a herd of horses I couldn't sell and debts I couldn't pay. Samuel's face had gone pale during these revelations. How many others? Near as we can figure, at least a dozen families in this county alone, the fourth man said. He was older, with silver hair, and the careful manner of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. I'm Frank Carson, by the way. Lost my spread 2 years ago to what I thought was just bad luck. But now you think differently, Trace said. Now I think we were all played for fools, Carson replied grimly. Kincaid and Blackwood have been running a long game, setting up ranches to fail so they can acquire our land cheaply. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What had started as an investigation into one family's financial troubles was revealing a systematic campaign to manipulate and destroy the independent ranchers of the Texas Panhandle. The question is, what do we do about it? Tom asked. We document everything, Trace said. Every fake deal, every manipulated contract, every foreclosure that followed the same pattern. And then we take it to someone who has the power to act. Who? Henderson asked, skeptically. Sheriff Garrett's in Blackwood's pocket, and the territorial government is 300 miles away. The Railroad Commission, Hallie said suddenly. If Kincaid and Blackwood are manipulating land sales along the proposed rail route, that's interstate commerce. The federal government would have jurisdiction. Trace nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. But we'll need more than just stories. We'll need documents, proof of the false contracts and manipulated loans. Some of that went up in smoke when I lost my place, Henderson said. Blackwood's men were very thorough about collecting all the paperwork. But not everything, Morrison added. I kept copies of some documents, hidden where they wouldn't think to look. Same here, Carson said. Old habits from the war: never trust anyone completely. Always keep backup records. Samuel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the land his family had worked for more than 2 decades. Even if we can prove they're criminals, it won't save this ranch. We still owe $600, and we've got 8 days to find it. Maybe saving the ranch isn't the most important thing anymore, Trace said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. Don't misunderstand me, he continued. I want to save this place as much as anyone, but if we can expose Blackwood and Kincaid, if we can stop them from destroying other families, maybe that's worth the sacrifice. No, Hallie said firmly. We're not giving up. This ranch represents everything my parents built together, everything they dreamed of, passing down to their children. We find a way to save it and stop the criminals. Her determination was infectious. Looking around the room, Trace could see the same resolve building in the other men's faces. All right then, Tom said. We fight on both fronts, gather evidence to expose their crimes, and find a way to raise the money to save the Cooper Ranch. How? Henderson asked practically. Trace had been thinking about that very question for days. We mortgage everything we can, pool our resources, and make a public appeal. If enough people understand what's at stake, we might be able to raise enough to keep the Coopers in business, Tom finished, and buy us time to build our case against Blackwood. It was a long shot, Trace knew. They were asking people who had little enough for themselves to contribute to saving someone else's ranch. But sometimes long shots were all you had. I'll ride to the county seat tomorrow, he said. Start filing complaints with whatever authorities will listen. The rest of you spread the word, gather documents, and see how much financial support we can drum up. As the meeting broke up and the men prepared to ride back to their own ranches, Hallie caught Trace's arm. This is dangerous, she said quietly. If Blackwood realizes how close we're getting to exposing him, he'll get desperate, Trace agreed. Desperate men make dangerous enemies. I don't want you to get hurt because of our problems. Trace looked into her eyes, seeing the woman who'd captured his heart without even trying. Hallie, these stopped being just your problems the moment I decided to stay. We're in this together now. She stood on her toes and kissed him then. A quick, sweet touch that nonetheless sent heat shooting through his entire body. Just promise me you'll be careful, she whispered. I promise, he said, though they both knew that careful might not be enough for what was coming. 8 days left, and the real battle was about to begin. The hidden deed was wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked inside Samuel's old trail boss gear, forgotten among spurs and rope and memories of better days. Hallie found it while searching through her father's belongings for any document that might help their cause, her fingers closing around the carefully preserved papers with a gasp of surprise. "Pa," she called, her voice tight with excitement, "you need to see this." Samuel looked up from the kitchen table where he'd been writing out his recollections of the cattle drive disaster, preparing a statement for the authorities. The past few days had been a whirlwind of activity gathering evidence, contacting witnesses, building a case against Kincaid and Blackwood that might not save their ranch, but could prevent other families from suffering the same fate. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his pen. Hallie spread the papers on the table with trembling hands. "It's the original deed to the ranch, and Pather's something else, something about mineral rights." Trace leaned over her shoulder to examine the documents, his heart beginning to race as he read the faded ink. The deed was dated 1870, when Samuel's father had first acquired the land from the state of Texas. But it was the additional paperwork that made his breath catch. "Samuel," he said quietly, "did you know your father filed for mineral rights on this property?" "Mineral rights?" Samuel frowned, moving closer to look at the papers. "Pa never said anything about minerals. Just wanted good grazing land for cattle. Look at this." Trace pointed to a section of the deed that had been executed separately from the main land purchase. "Your father filed a claim for all mineral rights beneath the surface of this property. Oil, coal, metals, everything." Hallie's eyes were wide with understanding. Which means you own whatever's under this land, separate from the surface rights," Trace finished. "And given what's been happening with mining claims in other parts of Texas." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their discovery, but this time it wasn't neighbors coming to help or enemies coming to threaten. It was Sheriff Garrett, alone, riding hard across the snow-covered ground with the urgency of a man bringing important news. "Cooper," the sheriff called as he dismounted, "we need to talk, all of you." They met him on the porch, the hidden deed still clutched in Hallie's hands. Sheriff Garrett was a solid man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of keeping the peace in frontier country. He'd always been fair in his dealings, if sometimes cautious about challenging powerful interests. "Sheriff," Samuel said, "what brings you out here?" Garrett's expression was grim. "Got word from the county seat this morning. There's been some developments in the investigation into Blackwood's business practices." "Investigation?" Trace asked. "Seems your complaints weren't the only ones," Garrett explained. "Federal marshals have been looking into reports of fraudulent land deals all along the proposed railroad route. Blackwood and Kincaid are wanted for questioning in connection with at least a dozen suspicious foreclosures." The news was better than they dared hope, but Garrett's expression suggested there was more to the story. "There's something else," the sheriff continued. "Something you need to know about your property specifically." He gestured toward the papers in Hallie's hands. "I see you found your father's original filing. Good thing, because you're going to need it." "Why?" Samuel asked. "Because 3 days ago, a mining company filed claims on this land, said the mineral rights had been abandoned and were available for new filing." Trace felt cold anger building in his chest. "Let me guess, the mining company is connected to Blackwood." "Panhandle Mining Corporation," Garrett confirmed. "Same principles as the development company that holds your loan. They've been systematically filing mineral claims on properties they're foreclosing on, claiming the original rights were forfeit due to non-payment of taxes." "But we've been paying taxes," Hallie protested. "Surface taxes, yes," Garrett said. "But apparently there are separate filings required for mineral rights, and most folks don't know about them. Blackwood's been using that loophole to acquire valuable mining claims for almost nothing." Samuel's face had gone white with understanding. The cattle drive, the pressure from Kincaid to keep moving despite the storm. He knew about the mineral rights even then. "Almost certainly," Garrett agreed. "The federal investigators think this whole scheme has been years in the making. Identify properties with valuable mineral potential, Arrange for the owners to fail financially, then acquire both the surface and mineral rights through foreclosure and legal technicalities. Trace studied the deed more carefully, noting the specific language that established the mineral rights claim. But if Samuel's father filed first, and we can prove continuous ownership, then the mineral rights belong to the Coopers, regardless of any subsequent claims. Garrett finished. The question is whether those rights are valuable enough to matter. The sheriff reached into his coat and withdrew a folded survey map. This might answer that question. It's a geological survey conducted last year by the railroad company, mapping potential resources along their proposed route. He spread the map on the porch railing, pointing to an area marked with symbols and notations. According to this survey, your property sits on top of what could be one of the richest copper deposits in Texas, possibly worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, enough to pay off every debt, save every threatened ranch in the county, and ensure the Cooper family's prosperity for generations. No wonder they wanted us gone, Hallie whispered. The question now, Garrett said, is what you want to do about it. The federal marshals are planning to move against Blackwood and Kincaid within the week, but they'll need your cooperation and testimony. Of course, Samuel said without hesitation, whatever it takes to stop them from hurting other families. Good, Garrett nodded. But I should warn you, Blackwood knows the investigation is closing in. He's getting desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. You'll need to be very careful until this is resolved. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple horses reached them from the direction of the main road. But this wasn't the measured approach of law enforcement or the casual pace of neighbors. This was the sound of men riding hard with hostile intent. Get inside, Trace ordered, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. All of you, but it was too late for concealment. Blackwood topped the rise with 8 men behind him, more than he'd ever brought before. They spread out as they approached the house, forming a loose circle that suggested they meant to control all approaches and escapes. Seems we have visitors, Garrett observed, his own hand resting on his weapon. Blackwood rode closer than he'd ever dared before, his black coat whipping in the wind, and his eyes holding the desperate gleam of a man whose carefully laid plans were crumbling around him. Sheriff Garrett, he called out with false cordiality. What brings the law out to this remote corner of the county? Official business, Garrett replied coolly. Same as brings you here, I imagine. Blackwood's gaze, fixed on the papers, spread across the porch railing, and his expression darkened. I see you've been digging through old documents, Cooper. I hope you haven't confused yourself with ancient history. Ancient history? Samuel stepped forward, the deed clutched in his hand. You mean like my father's legitimate claim to the mineral rights on this property? For the first time since Trace had known him, Blackwood looked genuinely shaken. Mineral rights that have been forfeit for non-payment of required fees. Required fees that were never properly disclosed, Garrett interjected. The federal investigators are very interested in how many property owners were unaware of their obligations in that regard. Blackwood's mask of civility finally slipped completely. Federal investigators can go to hell. This is local business, handled by local law. Not anymore, Garrett said calmly. As of this morning, this is a federal case involving interstate commerce and mail fraud. You're out of your jurisdiction, Blackwood. The standoff stretched taut as a guitar string, 8 armed men facing 3 defenders, and a sheriff whose authority was suddenly in question. Trace could feel the weight of his father's Colt on his hip, could sense Hallie's fear and Samuel's newfound determination. You know, Blackwood said conversationally, accidents happen all the time on remote ranches, fires mostly, especially in winter, when folks get careless with their heating stoves. The threat was unmistakable, and Trace saw Sheriff Garrett's face harden with resolve. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Blackwood, the sheriff said, made in front of a law enforcement officer. Just expressing concern for our neighbor's safety, Blackwood replied with a cold smile. Though I suppose if something were to happen to those old documents afire, perhaps, or simple misplacement, certain legal questions might become much easier to resolve. Samuel stepped forward, his shoulders square, and his voice strong. "Those documents are already filed with the county clerk and the federal land office. Destroying the originals won't change anything." Blackwood's eyes narrowed to slits. "We'll see about that." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, violence seeming inevitable. But then the sound of additional riders reached them, Tom Mitchell and half a dozen other ranchers, drawn by word that trouble was brewing at the Cooper Ranch. "Looks like you're outnumbered, Blackwood," Tom called as the reinforcements took positions around the ranch yard. Blackwood surveyed the assembled opposition, his calculating mind weighing odds and options. Finally, he wheeled his horse around, signaling his men to withdraw. "This isn't over, Cooper," he called back. "Not by a long shot." As Blackwood and his men retreated, Trace felt the tension begin to drain from his shoulders, but he knew this was just the calm before a much larger storm. "5 days left on the foreclosure," he said quietly. "Won't matter," Hallie replied, her voice strong with newfound confidence. "We've got the mineral rights, we've got witnesses, and we've got the law on our side." "We've got the law on our side," Trace agreed. "But Blackwood's got desperation on his, and desperate men don't always follow the rules." The hidden deed had changed everything, but it had also raised the stakes immeasurably. They were no longer fighting just for a ranch, they were fighting for a fortune. And Trace had learned long ago that fortunes were worth killing for. 5 days to go, and the real war was just beginning. Trace's father's Colt revolver lay on the kitchen table, cleaned and loaded, its worn grip testimony to years of faithful service. The weapon had seen action in the war, kept peace in frontier towns, and protected good people from bad intentions. Now it might be called upon once more to defend what was right against those who would take it by force. "Federal marshals will be here tomorrow," Sheriff Garrett had told them before riding back to town. "But tonight you're on your own. Blackwood knows his time is running out, and cornered animals are the most dangerous." The house felt different with armed men positioned around it. Tom Mitchell and his son were watching the north approach, while Frank Carson and Bill Henderson covered the south. Jake Morrison had taken position in the barn loft with a rifle, giving him a clear view of anyone approaching across the open ground. Inside, the Cooper family and their closest allies prepared for what might be their final stand. Samuel sat at the head of the table, looking more like his old self than he had in years. The trail boss badge gleamed on his chest, polished to a shine that reflected the lamplight. Beside him, Hallie moved with quiet efficiency, checking weapons and preparing supplies for a siege that might last until dawn. "Strange how things work out," Samuel mused, his fingers tracing the edge of the mineral rights deed. "All these years I thought I was a failure, that I'd lost everything that mattered. Turns out, my father left us the means to save ourselves, if we're brave enough to claim it." "Your father was a wise man," Trace replied, checking the action on his Colt one final time. "He understood that the real value of land isn't just what you can see on the surface." Hallie looked up from the ammunition she was counting. "What do you think Blackwood will try?" "Fire, most likely," Trace said grimly. "Burn the house and barn, destroy the documents, make it look like an accident. Without the original deed, proving your mineral rights claim becomes much harder. The copies we filed in town can be challenged as forgeries if the originals are destroyed," Samuel finished. "Blackwood's probably counting on confusion and delay to give him time to establish his own claims." A soft knock at the back door interrupted their conversation. Tom Mitchell's voice called quietly, "It's me. Got news." Trace opened the door to admit the rancher, whose face was tight with concern. "Spotted riders about 2 miles out," Tom reported. "Maybe a dozen men moving this way but staying off the main road. They're taking their time, probably waiting for full dark." "Any sign of Blackwood?" "Hard to tell from that distance, but I recognized a couple of his usual men. That scarred fellow who likes to make threats and the thin one who never talks." Trace nodded, his mind working through defensive possibilities. "How long until they reach us?" "Hour, maybe less if they pick up the pace." "All right." Trace turned to address the room. "This is it. Everyone knows their positions." Samuel stood, his hand resting on the butt of his own revolver. I'll take the front windows. Give me the best view of anyone approaching the porch. I'll be upstairs, Hallie said, shouldering a rifle with practiced ease. The bedroom window covers the east side where the barn blocks Morrison's view, and I'll float between positions as needed, Trace said. Tom, get back to your son and make sure everyone knows we don't start shooting unless they do. But if they come with fire or start threatening innocent lives, we end it quick. As Tom slipped back into the darkness, Trace caught Hallie's arm gently. There's something I need to say, in case. Don't, she interrupted softly. Don't talk like we won't all walk away from this. I love you, he said simply. Whatever happens tonight, I needed you to know that. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. I love you too, and we're going to have a lifetime to show each other just how much. She stood on her toes and kissed him, a fierce, desperate kiss that tasted of hope and fear and promises yet to be made. Then she broke away and headed for the stairs, her rifle in her hands and determination in every line of her body. Samuel watched his daughter go, then turned to Trace with something approaching a smile. She's got her mother's courage and her grandfather's stubborn streak. You're getting quite a woman. If we survive this, Trace replied. When we survive this, Samuel corrected firmly. I've got too much to live for now to let Blackwood's greed destroy what we've built. They took their positions as the last light faded from the western sky. The house fell silent except for the tick of the clock and the whisper of wind around the eaves. Outside, their neighbors waited in the cold, good men risking their lives to defend the principle that a family's home should be sacred. The first sign of trouble came from Morrison in the barn, loft 3 short whistles that meant riders approaching from the southeast. Trace moved to a side window and peered through the curtains, catching a glimpse of movement in the moonlight. Dark figures on horseback, spreading out to surround the house just as he'd predicted. From upstairs came Hallie's quiet voice. I count 8 men on this side. They're dismounting about 100 yards out. Same here, Samuel whispered from the front room. They're trying to get close without being seen. The waiting was the hardest part. Trace had been in enough fights to know that the minutes before action began always felt longer than the action itself. His heart was beating steadily, his hands were steady on his weapon, but his mind was churning through possibilities and contingencies. A flicker of light caught his eye, someone moving with a torch or lantern near the barn. Morrison's rifle cracked once, and the light disappeared with a curse and the sound of running feet. Warning shot, Trace called quietly to the others. They know we're ready for them. Blackwood's voice carried across the yard, carefully pitched to reach the house. Cooper, I know you're in there. We need to talk. Samuel moved to the front door but didn't open it. I can hear you fine from here, Blackwood. What do you want? Just to settle this like civilized men. No need for anyone to get hurt. Then ride away, Samuel replied. Leave us in peace and wait for the federal marshals to sort out the legal questions. I'm afraid that's not possible. Blackwood called back. You see, there's been a terrible accident. A fire at the county courthouse tonight. Seems like a lot of important documents were destroyed. The implication hit Trace like a physical blow. If Blackwood had burned the courthouse records, the copies of the mineral rights deed would be gone, leaving only the originals in the house as proof of the Cooper family's claim. You bastard, Samuel breathed, understanding the same thing. Now, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a more threatening tone. It seems to me that any reasonable man would want to protect his family from similar accidents. Houses burn so easily in winter, especially when folks get careless with their lamps. Is that a threat? Samuel called back. It's a reality, Cooper. Fire is unpredictable, dangerous. But it can be prevented if people are smart about it. Trace could see the trap closing around them. With the courthouse records destroyed, the original deed became infinitely more valuable and more dangerous to possess. Blackwood couldn't afford to let them keep it, but he also couldn't be seen to take it by force. So he'd burn them out and claim the fire was accidental, just another winter tragedy on an isolated ranch. Any documents destroyed in the blaze would be unfortunate but unavoidable losses. What do you want? Samuel asked, though they all knew the answer. Bring out the papers. Blackwood demanded. "The deed and any other documents related to mineral rights. Put them in the yard where we can see them, and then we'll discuss terms for your family's safety." "And if I refuse?" "Then I'm afraid accidents become much more likely." Trace could see torches being lit around the perimeter of the yard. Blackwood's men were preparing for arson, confident that isolated flames would be blamed on winter conditions and careless heating. "He's not bluffing," Trace whispered to Samuel. "They'll burn us out if we don't give them what they want. And if we do give them the deed." "They'll burn us out anyway," Trace replied grimly. "Can't leave witnesses to testify about threats and extortion." Samuel's face hardened with resolve. "Then we fight." From upstairs, Hallie's voice came soft but clear. "Two men, moving toward the house with torches. They're trying to stay in the shadows." "Take them," Trace called back quietly. Hallie's rifle spoke twice in quick succession, and they heard curses and the sound of men diving for cover. The torches disappeared, but Trace knew they'd only bought themselves a few minutes. "Cooper!" Blackwood's voice had lost all pretense of civility. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Go to hell, Blackwood," Samuel replied, and Trace heard 20 years of accumulated anger in those words. The attack came from 3 directions at once. Men with torches rushed the house, while others provided covering fire, their rifles lighting up the darkness with muzzle flashes. Trace's Colt bucked in his hand as he returned fire, aiming for the torchbearers who posed the greatest threat. Glass shattered in the front window as Samuel engaged targets approaching the porch. From upstairs, Hallie's rifle cracked steadily, her shots precise and deadly. Outside, their neighbors joined the fight, catching Blackwood's men in a crossfire they hadn't expected. "The barn!" Morrison's voice carried across the yard. "They've fired the barn." Orange light flickered against the windows as flames began to lick at the old wooden structure. Trace cursed, knowing that burning the barn was just the beginning. Once the fire took hold, it would spread to the house unless they could stop it. "Hallie," he called, "we need to get to the barn before the fire spreads." "I'm coming down," she replied, her footsteps quick on the stairs. But as she reached the bottom step, the kitchen window exploded inward in a shower of glass and burning cloth. A torch had been thrown through the opening, landing among the papers on the table and immediately setting them ablaze. "The deed!" Samuel lunged toward the burning documents, but Trace caught his arm. "It's too late," Trace said, watching their proof of ownership curl and blacken in the flames. "We've got to get out before the whole house goes up." The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, fed by dry wood and winter drafts. Smoke filled the kitchen, making it hard to breathe and harder to see. Through the chaos, they could hear Blackwood's men pressing their attack, taking advantage of the confusion to close in on the house. "The back door," Trace ordered. "We make for the woods and regroup." But as they reached the rear of the house, gunfire erupted from the darkness beyond the back porch. Blackwood had anticipated their escape route and positioned men to cut them off. They were trapped in a burning house, surrounded by enemies, with their most important evidence reduced to ash. It seemed like Blackwood had finally won. But Trace Morgan hadn't survived 6 years on the frontier by giving up when the odds turned against him. And Samuel Cooper hadn't earned his reputation as one of Texas's best trail bosses by backing down from a fight. "The root cellar," Samuel said suddenly. "There's a tunnel that leads to the old well. My father built it during the Indian troubles." "Can we reach it?" Trace asked, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. "If we move fast," Samuel replied. "The entrance is under the kitchen floor, but the fire hasn't reached that far yet." It was their only chance, as flames consumed the house around them and gunfire echoed through the night. The 3 of them prepared to descend into darkness and hope for one last chance at survival. Outside, Blackwood's voice rose above the chaos. "Burn it all, leave nothing standing." The final battle was about to begin. Samuel's trail boss whip cracked through the air like thunder, wrapping around the wrist of the gunman who'd cornered them at the tunnel entrance. The man screamed as leather bit into flesh, his pistol flying into the darkness as Samuel jerked him forward into Trace's waiting fist. They'd emerged from the underground passage into a nightmare of flame and gunfire. The house was fully engulfed now, orange tongues licking at the star-filled sky, while Blackwood's men celebrated what they thought was their final victory. But their celebration was premature. The Coopers and their defender had escaped the trap, and now they had the advantage of surprise. "Stay low," Trace whispered to Hallie as they crept through the smoke-filled yard. The acrid air burned their lungs and stung their eyes, but it also provided cover as they moved toward the positions where their neighbors were still holding out. The barn was a total loss, but Morrison had escaped the flames and taken refuge behind the water trough. Tom Mitchell and his son were pinned down near the corral, returning fire when they could but clearly outnumbered. Frank Carson's position had gone silent, and Trace feared the worst. "We need to even the odds," Samuel said, his trail boss whip coiled and ready in his hands. Years of commanding men and cattle had taught him to read a chaotic situation and find the points where pressure could be applied most effectively. Blackwood stood near the burning house, silhouetted against the flames like a demon surveying his handiwork. Two of his men flanked him, their rifles pointed toward the darkness where they expected enemies to emerge. They weren't watching their backs, confident that the fire had eliminated the primary threat. "I'll take Blackwood," Trace said, checking his ammunition. "You two circle around and help the others." "No," Hallie said firmly. "We stay together. We've come this far as a family, and we'll finish it as a family." Samuel nodded approvingly. "The girl's right. Besides, you'll need backup. Blackwood's got more men than we can see." They moved together through the chaos, using the smoke and shadows as cover. Trace's father's Colt felt solid and familiar in his hand, a weight that spoke of justice and the protection of the innocent. He'd carried this weapon through good times and bad, but never had its purpose felt more clear. The first gunman they encountered was reloading behind the ruins of the chicken coop. He looked up in surprise as three figures materialized out of the smoke, and his fumbling hands dropped cartridges as he tried to complete the reload. Trace's shot took him cleanly, and he crumpled without firing another round. "3 down," Samuel counted grimly, but too many still moving. The sound of their shot had alerted the others, and suddenly the night was filled with muzzle flashes as Blackwood's men tried to locate and eliminate the new threat. Bullets whined through the air around them, splintering wood and ricocheting off stone. Hallie's rifle barked twice in quick succession, and 2 more attackers stopped moving. She'd inherited her grandfather's steady hand and her mother's calm courage, and in the firelight she looked like an avenging angel protecting her home. "Morrison's still alive," Trace called, spotting the rancher's position near the water trough. "And I can see Tom moving toward the corral." The tide was beginning to turn. Blackwood's men had expected easy victory against a trapped family, not a coordinated defense by experienced fighters who knew the terrain. The element of surprise was shifting to the defenders, and with it, the momentum of the battle. Samuel's whip cracked again, this time catching a gunman's rifle and yanking it from his hands. The man reached for his sidearm, but Trace was already moving, his Colt speaking with deadly accuracy. The trail boss and the cowboy worked together with the fluid precision of men who understood each other's capabilities. "Blackwood's moving," Hallie warned, tracking the land agent's retreat toward his horse. "He's trying to escape." "Not after what he's done," Trace growled, changing direction to intercept the fleeing man. But Blackwood wasn't running in panic. As Trace closed the distance, he could see the land agent's cold smile in the firelight. This was a tactical withdrawal, not a rout, and Blackwood still had cards to play. "Morgan," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly over the gunfire. "You cost me everything, you interfering bastard. Time to pay the price." The scarred gunman who'd been with Blackwood from the beginning stepped out of the shadows, his rifle aimed directly at Trace's chest. At this range, there was no way he could miss. But Samuel Cooper had been a trail boss for 20 years, and trail bosses learned to protect their men. His whip sang through the air one final time, wrapping around the gunman's throat and jerking him sideways just as his rifle fired. The shot went wide, and Trace's return fire ended the threat permanently. "That's for every family you've destroyed," Samuel said grimly, coiling his whip. Blackwood's smile faltered as he realized his last protector was dead. Around the yard, the sounds of gunfire were diminishing as his remaining men either fell or fled into the darkness. The battle was turning against him, and for the first time in years, Ezra Blackwood was facing the possibility of defeat. "It's over, Blackwood," Trace called out, his Colt trained on the land agent's chest. "Surrender, and you might live to see trial." Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of humor or hope. "You think this ends anything? Even if you kill me, there are others who'll take my place. Men with more money, more influence, more willingness to do whatever it takes." "Maybe," Trace agreed. "But they'll know what happens to men who prey on families. They'll know the Cooper Ranch fought back and won." The final confrontation was at hand, and in the firelight of the burning house, 3 generations of the Cooper family prepared to defend what was theirs against a man who'd taken too much from too many people. The night was far from over. The copper deed that would secure their future lay not in the ashes of the house, but in Samuel's coat pocketer, second copy he'd forgotten about until this moment. As Blackwood raised his pistol for a final desperate shot, Samuel's hand moved to protect the document that represented his family's salvation. "Trace!" Hallie's warning came, just as Blackwood's gun cleared leather. Time slowed, as it often did in moments of mortal danger. Trace could see the desperation in Blackwood's eyes, the knowledge that defeat meant not just failure but likely death or prison. The land agent's pistol was coming up, his finger tightening on the trigger, when Samuel Cooper threw himself between them. The bullet meant for Trace took Samuel in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. But the trail boss had faced danger before, and pain was something to be endured, not surrendered to. Even as he fell, his hand was drawing his own weapon, his voice roaring with 20 years of command authority. "Not my family, you bastard!" Samuel's shot took Blackwood in the chest, the heavy .44 caliber bullet stopping the land agent's heart mid-beat. Ezra Blackwood toppled backward, his schemes and cruelties ended by the father he'd tried to destroy. "Pa!" Hallie dropped her rifle and rushed to Samuel's side, pressing her hands to the wound to stop the bleeding. "You're going to be all right. You have to be all right." Trace knelt beside them, his own hands helping to staunch the blood flow. The bullet had missed the major arteries, but Samuel was losing blood fast, and his face was already pale with shock. "The deed," Samuel whispered, his voice growing weak. "In my coat pocket. The mineral rights." "Don't talk," Hallie said fiercely. "Save your strength." Around them, the sounds of battle were fading, as Blackwood's remaining men realized their leader was dead and their cause was lost. Tom Mitchell's voice could be heard calling for the survivors to surrender, while Morrison emerged from cover to help secure the area. "Is it over?" Samuel asked, his eyes fighting to stay focused. "It's over, Pa," Hallie assured him. "The bad men are gone, and we're safe." Trace reached into Samuel's coat and withdrew the precious document, the original deed, with its mineral rights provisions intact. The paper was singed around the edges and spotted with blood, but the legal language was still clearly readable. "The courthouse fire won't matter," he told them both. "This is all the proof we need." Samuel managed a weak smile. "Funny thing about trail bosses," he whispered. "We always keep backup copies of important papers. Never know when you might need them." The sound of approaching horses reached them, not more enemies, but Sheriff Garrett, returning with federal marshals and a doctor from town. News of the fire had reached them, and they'd ridden hard through the night to provide assistance. "Over here," Trace called out, waving them towards Samuel's position. Dr. Whitman, the town's physician, was a competent man who'd treated everything from gunshot wounds to difficult births. He took one look at Samuel's injury and immediately began working to clean and bind the wound. "Bullet went clean through," he reported after a quick examination. "Missed the bone and the major blood vessels. He's lost some blood, but he should recover fully with proper care." Relief flooded through Trace like a physical wave. They'd survived not just the battle, but the war. Blackwood was dead. His men were scattered or captured, and the Cooper family would live to see another day. Federal Marshal James Crawford surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd investigated similar crimes across the frontier. "Quite a fight you had here," he observed. "Though from what I can see, justice was served." "Blackwood burned the courthouse to destroy evidence," Trace explained, showing the marshal the copper deed. "But we managed to save the original mineral rights documentation." Crawford examined the papers carefully, noting the official seals and signatures. "This appears to be legitimate. Combined with the testimony we'll gather from the surviving witnesses, it should be more than enough to establish your claim." Sheriff Garrett had been examining Blackwood's body and the scattered weapons of his men. "Looks like they came prepared for a massacre," he said grimly. "Good thing you folks were ready for them." As dawn broke over the Texas Panhandle, the full extent of the night's events became clear. The house was a total loss, but the barn could be rebuilt. More importantly, the family was alive, and their future was secure. Tom Mitchell appeared with a blanket, which Hallie gratefully wrapped around her wounded father. "Mary's preparing a room at our place," he offered. "You can stay with us until you get back on your feet." "Appreciate it, Tom," Samuel said, his voice stronger now that the bleeding had stopped. "But I think we'll be rebuilding right here. This is Cooper land, and Coopers don't run from a little setback." Hallie looked at the ruins of her childhood home, then at Trace. "What do you think? Ready to help us build something new?" Trace pulled the compass from his vest pocket and checked its heading one final time. The needle pointed steadily toward the rising sun, toward new beginnings and the promise of a shared future. "I think," he said, sliding the compass back into his pocket, "it's time I stopped wandering and started building something that lasts." The copper deed gleamed in the morning light, its legal language promising prosperity beyond their wildest dreams. But more valuable than any mineral wealth was what they'd fought for, and one's right to call this place home, and the chance to build that home together. 3 months later, spring had returned to the Texas Panhandle with a vengeance. The new house stood where the old one had burned, larger and more solid than its predecessor, built with lumber purchased using the first payments from the copper mining lease. Samuel Cooper sat on the wide front porch, his arm still occasionally stiff from the bullet wound, but his eyes clear and bright with purpose. The new wedding rings caught the afternoon sunlight as Hallie and Trace worked together in the garden behind the house. Simple gold bands, purchased from the jeweler in town with money that represented hope rather than desperation. They'd been married a month ago in a ceremony that brought together every rancher in 3 counties, a celebration of love that had grown from shared struggle. "Hard to believe it's the same place," Tom Mitchell observed, settling into the chair beside Samuel with a satisfied grunt. He'd ridden over to discuss plans for the community school they were building with funds from the mineral rights lease. Education was important, and children deserved better opportunities than previous generations had enjoyed. "Everything looks different when you see it with clear eyes," Samuel replied, watching his daughter and son-in-law planning their future garden. 4 months ago I was ready to give up. Let Blackwood take everything. Now look at us." The transformation was remarkable. Samuel had been sober for 3 months now, his hands steady and his mind sharp. The trail boss badge gleamed on his vest, worn now with pride rather than shame. He'd found purpose again in helping other families avoid the traps that had nearly destroyed his own. "Federal prosecutor says the trials should start next month," Tom reported. "Kincaid's been arrested in Kansas, and they've uncovered evidence of similar schemes in 4 other territories." "Good," Samuel said with quiet satisfaction. "Maybe other families won't have to go through what we did." The sound of laughter drew their attention to the garden, where Trace was teaching Hallie how to properly stake tomato plants. She was a quick learner, her hands sure and capable as she worked the rich soil. The spring planting was going well, and they expected a good harvest come fall. "You picked a good one," Tom observed, nodding toward Trace. "Hallie did the picking," Samuel corrected with a smile. "I just had the sense to get out of her way." Trace looked up from the garden and waved, his face showing the contentment of a man who'd found his place in the world. The restless energy that had driven him from town to town for 6 years had settled into the steady rhythm of a life built around family and community. His compass no longer pointed toward distant horizons, it had found its true north right here. The mining company wants to increase the lease payments, Samuel continued. Seems the copper deposits are even richer than they first thought. We'll be able to help rebuild the Henderson place, maybe buy back some of the other properties Blackwood stole. It was fitting justice. The wealth Blackwood had schemed to steal was now being used to repair the damage he'd done. Bill Henderson would have his ranch back, and other families would have the chance to reclaim their heritage. Mary Mitchell appeared on the porch with a pitcher of lemonade and glasses for everyone. "Thought you might be getting thirsty," she said, settling into her own chair. "Hot day for spring." "Perfect day for planting," Hallie called from the garden, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "The soil's just right, not too wet, not too dry." As they shared the cool drink, Samuel reflected on the changes the past months had brought. The physical transformation of the ranch was obvious: new buildings, improved fences, modern equipment, purchased with mining lease money. But the deeper changes were more important. He'd reclaimed his sobriety, his self-respect, and his role as head of the family. The ghosts of that terrible blizzard night still visited his dreams sometimes, but they no longer controlled his waking hours. "What's that Trace is burying over there?" Tom asked, pointing to where the cowboy was working with a small shovel near the garden's edge. Samuel smiled, understanding what his soon-to-be son-in-law was doing. "Time capsule of sorts. Letters from Sarah, that engagement ring he's been carrying around. Figure it's time to let the past rest so the future can take root." It was a symbolic gesture, but symbols had power. For 6 years, Trace had carried reminders of love lost, using them as barriers against new attachment. Now he was laying them to rest with ceremony and respect, making space in his heart for the love he'd found with Hallie. The late afternoon brought visitors, neighbors, stopping by to share news, offer help, or simply enjoy the fellowship that had grown stronger since the night of Blackwood's attack. Frank Carson had recovered from his wounds and was back to ranching with his usual determination. Jake Morrison's family was thriving, their debts cleared and their future secure. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the visitors gradually departed for their own homes. Samuel remained on the porch, watching as Trace and Hallie finished their work in the garden. They moved together with the easy coordination of partners who understood each other completely, their love evident in every shared glance and gentle touch. "Beautiful evening," Hallie said, as she and Trace joined Samuel on the porch, their work finished for the day. "Beautiful life," Trace replied, settling into a chair with Hallie beside him. "6 months ago, I was just another drifter with no place to call home. Now I've got more blessings than I know what to do with." Samuel reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the lamplighter new compass, brass and silver, with an inscription on the back. "Wedding gift," he explained, handing it to Trace. "Thought you might want one that's not quite so old." Trace opened the compass and read the inscription, "For finding your way home." He looked up at his new father-in-law with genuine emotion. "Thank you for everything." "Thank you," Samuel replied, "for seeing something worth saving in a broken-down old drunk and his stubborn daughter." Hallie laughed, the sound like music in the evening air. "Who are you calling stubborn?" As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together on the porch of their new home, planning the future and savoring the present. The compass in Trace's pocket pointed steadily toward magnetic north, but his heart had found a different kind of direction, toward love, toward family, toward the home they were building together with their own hands and dreams. In the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in pastures green with spring grass. The sound that had once triggered Samuel's nightmares now spoke of prosperity and peace. The Cooper Ranch was not just surviving, it was thriving, a testament to the power of love, determination, and the courage to fight for what matters most. Sometimes the loneliest cowboy finds that helping others leads him home. And sometimes home is not a place you find, but a life you build, one day at a time, with the people you love standing beside you through every storm and every season of blessing that follows.